move forward. Yep. So I thought before we dive right into the data, it would be good just to set the context. So I'll just be briefly covering off on our definitions and methodology and how we actually collected the information, and particularly given COVID was such a main had such a main impact, particularly along the eastern states. So feel free to pop questions into the chat as we go along, as I'd like to make sure that the audience gets as much out of this presentation as possible. And if we do run out of time at the end, happy to take all the unanswered questions and get back to people. Okay. So what is homelessness? So the ABS, we define homelessness, and it's based on an understanding of when you don't have a home rather than if you don't have a roof over your head. And we acknowledge that it's very much a Western interpretation of what we mean by home. And so that has implications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities who have their own perspectives on what homelessness means. But we try to cater for that in our processes, but just need to bear in mind when you're interpreting some of the data that people do have different perspectives. Homelessness is actually based on the sense of security, stability, privacy, safety, and able to control your own living space. So when you lack one or more of those elements, that's what we define as homelessness. So on screen, you'll see it's when people without suitable accommodation alternatives, the homelessness if they're in an inadequate dwelling, they don't have tenure, or their tenure is short or non-ongoing, and they lack control or access to space for social relations. That said, we do have a few exclusions. So people who are in correctional facilities, hospitals, rehabilitation centres, student halls, some religious institutions. So we exclude some of those. Okay, next page. Yeah, so our definition describes homelessness into 6 groups. So you're probably familiar with these when you look through our publications. So when we're talking about people living in improvised dwellings, tents, or sleeping out, what we generally mean are people who are rough sleeping or living rough. People in supported accommodation for the homeless generally include people who are staying in hostels for the homeless. They might be in night shelters, or they're in refuges. The third group, people staying temporarily with other households. That's another word for people who are couch surfing. People who are living in boarding houses. Then you've got people in other temporary lodgings, and they're mainly when people get brokered into hotels or motels. And lastly, we have people living in severely crowded dwellings. And so it's not just about the inconvenience of a little bit of crowding. We're talking about at the extreme ends. And so we're talking about where you need at least 4 or more extra bedrooms for all the occupants in a private dwelling. And it's important to note that homelessness is not actually a concept that we measure directly off the form. So there's no such questions. What we need to do is we look at the characteristics of the person who report to the form, and then we apply assumptions about the way they might have responded to particular questions. And then we decide on balance if they're likely to have been homeless on census night. Okay, next slide. So before we went into the field, these are just some of the improvements that we made for the 2021 census. So the aim of doing these things is ultimately to improve the quality of the estimates. So the main things that we did were some improvements to the census form. We increased the capacity of the online census form so that people up to 25 number of people in a household can report. So that just makes it easier for people in overcrowded households to fully participate. We also added extra information to the front of the form, and that's important to to inform the people who's filling out the form that everyone in the household needs to participate, including visitors. So the purpose of that is to make sure that we're also capturing people who might be couch surfing. Lastly, we did a little bit of rewording of the usual address question. So if you remember back to the census household form, we had a question, where do you usually live? So we added some additional reasons. So if people had family conflict or evictions as reasons, then they were asked to report none for that particular question. So one of the other big improvements that we did was we got access to additional administrative information from both state and territory governments and homeless service providers. We normally do that each census, but this time around we got not only additional lists, but we got additional information as well. So that just helps us identify the locations of where people who are experiencing homelessness are, and also the nature of the homelessness. So that just helps us to determine in which category of homelessness that people belong to, or whether they are outside the scope of our population. So several states and territory governments, they provided address lists of temporary accommodation. So the locations of hotel motels that they generally triage people to, particularly if there's no vacancies at existing services. So that you'll see later how that impacts on the data quality when we start looking through the data. But the purpose of that was to improve the count of people in those hotels and motels. We also had lists from supported for people in those hostels, refuges, and night shelters. So we worked with state and territory governments to make sure that we got a high quality list of addresses, and so therefore having a high quality outputs for people in supported accommodation for the homeless. Okay, next slide. So as we know, we can do the best planning in the world, but there's always something that comes up, and this happened to be COVID. So how did we actually enumerate people when we had COVID restrictions and lockdowns across the many states and territories? Like, it wasn't one size fit all. So we had to be quite agile to the point where we had to tailor our enumeration approach to suit the specific lockdown condition. And it's important to note that for the majority of people, most were at home and completing the census online. So when you talk about people who are couch surfing or people in overcrowding, the quality of the information is very high because of people being at home. But in terms of the other homeless cohorts, the lockdown restrictions actually made it more difficult for us to get our field officers into out into the field. So those officers would be enumerating people who were sleeping rough and people who were in hotel motels and hostels, night shelters and refuges. So we had to tailor our approach just to make sure that we're making sure that the public is safe, as well as our field staff. So if we think back to what was happening around census night, like in the Greater Sydney region and its surrounding areas, we ended up not undertaking enumeration of rough sleepers because of the lockdowns in New South Wales. So instead, we relied on administrative data from New South Wales DCJ. So they gratefully supplied us with counts and characteristics of people who were rough sleeping, and they were also able to provide us with counts and details around people who are staying in hotel and motels. And I'll just mention up front that the information that we always receive is de-identified, so no way can we identify an individual from those lists that we received. In Victoria, we had to do what's called a contactless approach, which is basically no interactions with people on the streets. And it's basically by observation. If we knew information about a particular person, like if we had other information from a service provider who could provide us additional information, then we would include that in the enumeration. So the contactless approach was used in metropolitan Melbourne, and we delayed it by 2 weeks. Given that the population was in lockdown, it was a safe bet that also people on the streets were not moving around as easily either. So delaying it by 2 weeks would have had minimal impact to the counts. Launch housing, with the consent of their project partners, they were able to provide a de-identified list of rough sleepers for the city of Port Phillip LGA. Once again, we couldn't get our staff into that area, so we gratefully accepted the list from Launch Housing. Homes Victoria also provided some admin data for people who were in hotel and motels as well. And each of those data sets, we used that to either substitute information for the lack of response in the field, but also we used it to supplement information where we were able to get field staff out into particular areas. So it was a combination of substitution and supplementation. In the ACT, they went into lockdown shortly after we finished the rough sleeper enumeration. Rough sleeper enumeration proceeded as normal in the other states and territories, with the exception of Cairns and Yarrabah, where it was briefly delayed. Okay, next slide. So to produce the estimates, oops, one screen too far, thank you. So to produce the estimates, we rely on an agreed method to identify people who are likely to be homeless. And in our publication, if you go to the methodology section, it will give you precisely all the detail that you need to know about how we actually estimate the population. This methodology is actually the same as what we applied in the last census and the earlier census years back to 2001. And so that just gives reassurance when you're looking at the movements of homelessness from 2001 to 2021, that it's a consistent time series, and you can make judgments between years because you know that the data points are consistent over time. The only adjustments we make each census is where we make some tweaks to the monetary cutoffs. So we have some filters that we apply around income and rent payments and mortgage payments. So we make some adjustments each census years, and also we make adjustments around the country of birth of humanitarian migrants, because we know that that group of people is important to be included in our homeless couch surfing estimates. And as I mentioned earlier, with the additional list that we got for boarding houses, so in Victoria, we have the Victorian Rooming House Register. So that wasn't available in 2016, and we used that for 2021. Of course, we went through a process to identify those dwellings which are providing accommodation for homeless people. But that was used sort of first time in 2021, and you'll see that what the impact of that is to the estimates. Likewise, those temporary accommodation lists of hotel motels that we've received from New South Wales DCJ and Homes Victoria, you'll also see that the impact of that to our estimates. So both of those are about improving the data quality, but what it does mean is that the data series is not comparable between 2016 to 2021. Also, I already mentioned about the admin data use that from New South Wales DCJ and Launch Housing in improving the estimates around rough sleeping. Okay, so I'll just pause for now. There's probably a lot of information for people to digest, so I'll open it to the floor for people to ask questions.
Any questions? I just note we're actually running about 10 to 15 minutes slower than the sort of outline. So there's a few questions in the chat, which I think, am I right? And so one of them, Phillip, is will you be able to share the slides? Oh, yes, James has already confirmed we'll share the slides. And I think also you were going to answer some questions if they came through in the chat. We didn't get time for them as well, weren't you? Yeah, so that's fantastic. Right. So we can follow up with people afterwards. So maybe if we can move straight into the key findings, national findings, and then have questions about the methodology and the findings nationally after that.
Sure.
Yes, sounds good.
Thanks, Phillip.
Okay, and thanks very much, Kate. I'll make a start on some of the key findings. So yeah, my name is James Mowle. I work with Phillip on the homelessness estimates from our census. So it's a mammoth task, and we really appreciate the joint effort that we have with the sector to compile these statistics. Before I get into it, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today as well. So I'm joining you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and pay respects and acknowledge any traditional First Nations people joining us today. So in terms of key points, I'll be pretty quick with this because I recognise that you guys probably may have seen some of this info and keen to get into state and territory level of info and some time for questions. So overall, we did see an increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness, a 5.2% increase. But then when we compare that to the overall population, we actually saw a drop in the rate of homelessness per 10,000 people. So it went down from 49.8 people to 48.2 people. So a little bit of a increase in the number, but a decrease as a proportion of the overall population in Australia. We did see a more of an increase in females in 2021 compared to males. So almost 80% of the increase in number of people experiencing homelessness were female. So they increased by about 10%, whereas the number of males increased by less than 2%. So that's beginning of the theme that we're seeing, at least at a national level, and we might see some of that differ at some state territory levels. We might move on to the next slide, Kate, please. So Phillip introduced the operational group that we use to understand people experiencing homelessness and their circumstances on census night. So here's just a graph with the counts of people over those 4 time periods that we have from 2006 to 2021. So you get a sense of how things are changing over time. And what we saw in 2021, we saw fewer people sleeping rough in improvised dwelling tents or sleeping out, and fewer people in severely crowded dwellings and staying temporarily with other households. We did see more people in supported accommodation for the homeless, more people in boarding houses, and a very large increase in the other temporary lodgings category as well, which is a combination of implications of some responses to COVID, as well as better use of administrative list information that we've got to capture that population group. We might move on to the next slide. Here's just a age distribution of the 120 odd thousand people that we had in 2021 experiencing homelessness. So the highest rates and the highest numbers were in the middle age groups. So there's a focus on youth homelessness and younger people, and we saw some significant increases in those groups in 2021, as well as older people as well. So we might move on to the next slide. So we mentioned before, women were one of the groups that increase their high increase in numbers in 2021 compared to males. So I mentioned we almost had the 10% increase in number of females experiencing homelessness. The increase was mainly seen in supported accommodation. So you can see a bit of a difference in the number of males compared to the number of females in supported accommodation at the time of census. And then the next slide is just a little bit of a comparison of the age distribution in 5-year age groups and how that has changed from 2016, our last census, to 2021. So we're seeing a small decrease in people aged 20 to 24 and some higher increases in the people aged 30 to 34 age group. So I might move on to the next slide, which I think is questions. So I don't know. Sorry, that was quite brief, but I'm trying to, I suppose, catch up a little bit so that we do have time to examine some of the movements at a state level.
Thanks, James. I'm just going to stop screen sharing because otherwise I can't see if people want to ask a question. I've got a question from Tony Wren. Just have to go off mute, Tony.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hosting and thanks to the Census guys for doing this. Would you be able to just go back to that last slide? Because actually that age is really interesting to us. And maybe just what are the highlights? I mean, we've been hearing a lot about older women as the fastest growing group. And my understanding from Kate explaining it to me, that's from a low base.
Yeah, and we actually found, so really good thing for us to focus on, Tony. And I probably recognise there's a lot going on in this graph as well, or these two graphs, because you've got, you're showing the proportion of people by age group, but then also by their homeless operational group. I don't know, so it's getting quite complex. In terms of the older females, we actually saw the fastest growing cohorts and the fastest growing groups that we saw both in numbers and rates were actually in middle-aged women and children. So the number of females aged 35 to 44 increased by almost 20%, and females, female children aged 12 to 18 increased by almost 18%. And then young children aged under 12 increased by about 11%. for both you know, boys aged under 12 and girls aged under 12.
So the females, is it 13 to 18?
12 to 18.
Oh, 12 to 18,
Yeah.
and that was 18%.
Yeah, and I recognise that I'm probably saying different numbers to what the categories that we have on this graph in front of us are. So I'm sorry if that's confusing.
No, I think that's a really important, those sorts of breakdowns. Do you have them anywhere else then, perhaps? Or we've just got these slides?
In the raw data, Tony. So yeah, I can help you with that later.
Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, so what we're seeing though is that the fastest growing is that middle-aged women and children.
Yes. Yeah.
And if we say that's between 2016 and 2021.
Yes, yeah, and
Right.
so the one thing that we don't have in our census data is so census is very good at counting people and working out numbers, but particularly people outside of you know, our usual private dwellings where vast majority of people live. Census is not very good, and we don't have questions to understand if you know, children are accompanied or unaccompanied by adults, and even whether, you know, two adults are accompanied together or separately. So we don't really have that relationship information. And I know some of the HW collections for supported accommodation, do go into that and provide some of that. But that's one of the limitations that we very aware of with our census data.
Okay.
Over to Anna. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, James. Anna, did you have a question? Anna Scannella? Just need to unmute.
Hi, I do. I'm just wondering why I'm with Y Foundations, and we use a lot of the youth homelessness data or statistics, age brackets in particular. And we notice that the age brackets that appear in the data spreadsheets that you can download from the Census website in the Census homelessness section do not align with the age groups that appear in the Census population data spreadsheets that you can also download from the website. So I'm wondering why they aren't aligned, and if it's possible to have some sort of alignment so that for organisations that are less resourced, that need to respond to things fairly quickly in terms of evidence-based arguments or positions that we might be putting, can actually resource that stuff really quickly. But also on the AIH data, and I'm glad you mentioned that as well, why there's no alignment as well, or has there been any thought about trying to align those age brackets and data so that you can kind of refer back to the census when you're talking about, say, the proportion of young people in the 15 to 19 year age bracket who might be homeless as distinct from the proportion or the percentage that they make up of the total population. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. That's a really good question and really good observation around having data that's usable. And I don't know, I probably recognise and empathise with you in grappling with looking at different even presentations of census data and seeing different age groups. I'm going to refer to Phil because like he's got a lot more history and context and time in particularly the census homelessness space. Might be able to shed some light and help you, Anna.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Anna. It's more of a legacy question. The fact that we've had, was it 3 or 4 censuses reporting on this way, it's resource-wise, it's much easier if you just reproduce 2021 on the same basis. But I do take your point that being comparable to other data sources, both internally and externally, does make sense. But that said, we are releasing our table builder product towards the end of April. my understanding is it's going to be free if you take up an organisational license, unlike in the past. So you should be able to go and extract your data and cut it any which way you like and output. So you'll have access to both 2021 and also 2016 in Table Builder. Unfortunately, we don't have a Table Builder product for earlier years. Yeah, but that should be able to help you put your information needs on whatever age groups that you need to.
So Phillip, to butt in, but is that organisational licence free for not-for-profits?
Yes, it's free.
Great, thank you.
We'll just take one, thanks. We'll just take one more question from Deb and then move through to the state breakdowns. Just need to unmute Deb.
Got it. Thanks, Kate. And thanks, Phillip and James. This is all really helpful. I'm going to ask you a bit of a technical sort of data question. I'm looking to do some research, sort of looking at trends over time with the census data. Obviously, from what you've said, directly comparing some of those operational groups, especially boarding house groups in Victoria, and at the temporary accommodation group as well over time is probably not very feasible. Do you have or does the ABS have a position on whether we can compare the overall number of people experiencing homelessness over time? And the reason I ask that is because I can see how, especially with COVID, you know, a lot of those people who are in temporary accommodation would have been sleeping rough and probably would have been in those numbers on census night. So you could sort of say it's the overall population might be more reliable than just operational group. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Deb. That would be, I mean, technically, I think we would be able to distinguish between whether we received the information through, whether it's through administrative data or if we received it from the, directly from the field. But then it's difficult to disentangle the two because the way we quality assure our information, it's like a overall approach, and so you might have overlaps where we received administrative data, but we rejected it because the quality wasn't sufficient. So it's very hard to know which is the what's the impact overall on which direction we took in terms of the quality checking. Yeah, so I guess the short answer would be you might be able to get a proxy number, maybe a percentage, but whether that's sufficient for your research, that would be a different conversation. And I guess whether the ABS would be willing to share that information as well.
Thanks so much. So now we're into the states, and that's, as I say, big country, 8 states and territories. And I think we're down to 5 minutes per state, including questions. Over to you. Is it James?
Yeah, I'll make a start and I'll hand over to Phillip. And also just recognising, so yeah, Kate, I'm more than happy for you to share these slides with people dialing in today as well. So yeah, so don't necessarily be taking down too many notes or get too concerned if we're going a little bit too quickly, if you'll go back and refer to things. And it's also worth noting, so everything that we've got here will be either in the spreadsheets, which are already up on the ABS website to download, or in the Table Builder product, which we will be releasing towards the end of April or early May. So New South Wales, you can see this is just a graph showing the change in people by operational group, and it's quite interesting seeing the context back to 2006, as well as the noting the change between 2016 and 2021. So New South Wales, we did see decreases in people living in severely crowded dwellings, as well as people in improvised dwellings, tents, sleeping out, so the rough sleepers. But we did see increases in people in boarding houses and other temporary lodgings. So we move on to the next slide. So this slide shows on the left-hand side just the overall number of people experiencing homelessness in New South Wales on census night, but also shows it for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are experiencing census homelessness on census night as well. So just as a bit of a contrast. So again, it's slightly different trends for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, recognising that the numbers are smaller than the overall group in New South Wales. Might move on to the next slide. So this just shows the age groups, and again, I think we've gone with the age groups which are in our published spreadsheets on the website. So you can see decreases, particularly for the age groups of between 19 and 24, and 25 and 34, which is a little bit at odds to what we're seeing in some other states and territories in particular, which is interesting. And then in terms of areas within New South Wales, we've just pulled out the local government areas with, sorry, Kate, this is on the next slide. We've just pulled out the local government areas, the 5 with the highest counts of people on census night. So, Sydney, Canterbury, Bankstown, Inner West, Cumberland, Bankstown. So very much concentrated in Sydney. And then some notable changes that we're seeing both in Sydney, but then you can also see Central Coast and Newcastle having some changes with quite a large increase in Newcastle and a bit of a decrease in the Central Coast in overall numbers.
Thanks, James. I think we've got time for one question on the New South Wales data. Is anyone keeping in mind that New South Wales was the outlier in terms of or one of the outliers in terms of the overall number increasing, but in New South Wales decreasing. So I'm just wondering if any, apart from what we've seen, I can't see everyone's hands. I'm not actually sure if someone's asking to ask a question or not. I'll flip through everyone. Doesn't look like it. All right. Well, we can potentially come back. There might be a few minutes at the end if we come up with a New South Wales specific question, but maybe we just keep on going through to Victoria.
Okay, thank you. And it's worth noting, so this local government area information is in the spreadsheets on the website as well. So it is up there for everyone to download and interrogate if you're like playing around with the Excel spreadsheets like I do. Phil, I might get you to
sure.
talk through the next couple of states.
Yep. Yeah, so Victoria is equally interesting as all the states are. So we'll see that our overcrowding hasn't really changed much. It's increased marginally. As I talked about earlier about new sources of admin data, the boarding house series, which is the yellow line, has increased quite substantially, and that's because of that use of the Victorian Rooming House Register. That increase is about 95%. But if you look at, say, couch surfing, that's decreased by about 17%. So it might be due to the stay-at-home measures and travel restrictions at that point in time in Victoria. But you'll also see that there's an increase in other temporary lodgings, which are like people who are in the hotel motels. Once again, that's that new admin data source that we acquired from Homes Victoria. But in terms of rough sleeping, a slight decrease there, and supported accommodation, there's a slight increase there as well. Okay, next slide, James. Okay. Yeah, so when we look at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, we see that there's quite a increase in the hostel shelters and refuges. And so that's up by 46%. And once again, that increase in the hotel motels is because of that new data source. So I'm assuming that the audience yeah, I'm assuming that people understand that increase. If we just move on to the next slide. Yeah, when we look at the breakdown by sex, both male and female homelessness has actually increased for all age groups. But the largest increase is for the age group between 25 to 34. So that's gone up by 45%. And as James said earlier, like, it'll be really handy if we're able to identify not just the individuals, but where there are families. If we're able to identify the families within the data as well, because that increase in the supported accommodation, like the hotel shelters, like, it'll be useful to see if it's because of increase in families, whether that's because of domestic violence or youth, or like, it'll be good just to understand that family dimension of the information. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so if we look at the top 5 LGAs, the main being Greater Dandenong. So all of these LGAs, because I don't live in Melbourne, I don't really have a good grasp of where these areas are. So I'm assuming that most of these are just outside of the inner city. And then if you look at the top LGA changes, a lot of the increase is driven by that boarding house data source. So you'll see that it features quite prominently in each of these LGA changes, except for Melbourne, where the Melbourne LGA, the decrease was because of severe crowding, where it's actually declined.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Did people have any questions on Victoria?
Maybe just reflect on Victoria's figures that the increase, so just going back to operational groups in supported accommodation for the homeless, would have been influenced in part by the fact that there were more resources for supported accommodation for the homeless at that time, and also more resources for persons in other temporary lodgings. So there's sort of a question in my mind as to whether or not that's about incidence or availability of resources, that increase. Not seeing any other, sorry, flicking through the wrong thing, any other questions, so we can sail through to who comes after Victoria is Queensland.
Yes, so Queensland, this would be the first state where there would be minimal impact because of new admin data sources. So you could probably consider 2016 to 2021 comparable. So with Queensland, you'll see that all the homeless groups increased from 2016 to 2021, except for those in boarding houses. And once again, people in severely crowded dwellings is the most prevalent group. If we move to the next slide, yep. So if you consider the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, it's very noticeable that severe crowding is the most prevalent, although there was a decrease from 2016 to 2021, and there was an increase in people in hostel shelters and refuges. If you go to the next slide, okay. Yeah, if we look at the male-female splits, so those aged 25 to 34 years are the most common or the most prevalent age group for homelessness. And you'll see that there's an increase in the 0 to 11 category. And that's increased by 15 or 16%. And you'll also note that there's an increase in female homelessness across most of those age groups as well. And it's also interesting that it doesn't tail off as quickly from 35 to 44 through to 65 to 74. It tends to hover around similar extent of homelessness as well. Okay, next slide. Once again, the top 5 LGAs. Brisbane is by far the biggest LGA, not just for Queensland, but also Australia-wide. And if you look at the changes, Brisbane has actually declined by about 1,300 people, whereas there are increases in those other top LGAs, except for Palm Island. And it's interesting to also note that it's mainly the severe crowding that is driving those changes. So when we go back to that first graph of Queensland, how it showed that overcrowding was the most prevalent form of homelessness, you'll see that these are the LGAs which are contributing to that. Okay, on to South Australia, unless people had questions on Queensland.
Can I just ask if there's any sort of Queensland colleagues who will know whether or not there was additional funding for crisis accommodation in August 2021? Not flicking through and not seeing colleagues that I recognise as Queensland colleagues. So maybe if we just keep going through to South Australia. Thanks, Phillip.
Yep. If you can just scroll through to South Australia. Yep. Thank you, Kate. So this one's an interesting one, where in 2016, you'll notice that the most prevalent group of homelessness were people in severely crowded dwellings. As you move forward to 2021, that's been overtaken by people in supported accommodation. So I'm assuming that there's a lot more going in South Australia to encourage uptake into supported accommodation, and that was not the case in 2016. And there's also a small increase in hotel motels. So people who was in other temporary lodgings, that light blue bar. So you'll see that there's a bit of an upswing in that as well. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So here you will see that severe overcrowding back in 2016 was previously the most prevalent, but now it's overtaken by people in hostels, shelters and refuges. So that's quite a substantial increase in that category. Hostel, shelters and refuges has increased by about 74%. And you'll notice that the small increase in hotel motels, so that's gone up by a factor of 7. If we look at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population on the right, it very much mirrors the state situation. So it's a similar pattern, but it's just on a smaller scale.
Can I just jump in there, Phillip, and ask if anyone from South Australia would be aware whether or not over that period there's been significant increases in South Australian investment in shelters and refuges?
Hi, it's Ashley from the Salvation Army in South Australia. There wasn't in the sense of permanent shelters or refuges. It was just during the COVID period. They opened up a whole lot of facilities that were being unused. So they housed people during that period. But then obviously since that's changed, that's all been removed.
So that temporary accommodation was still going in August 2021?
Yeah, there was still a lot going, and then it finished up, I think, more around September, October.
Great, thanks for that, Ashley. That's really useful.
And that's unfortunately one of the things that we can't discern from the census data is what where those people would have been in terms of their operational groups had it not been for some of those responses at the time of in response to COVID. So yeah, particularly for some of those short-term supports. So I think you would expect or maybe see some of those would be dispersed through some other operational groups. But we just can't tell the extent, at least from this source.
Yeah. So back to you, Phillip.
Thank you, Kate. If we move to the next slide, please. So we've seen increases across most age groups, and the most noticeable one here is the large increase in those aged 0 to 11. So that's gone up by about 68%, followed by increases in 12 to 18 age group. So that's up by about 30%. And then the 25 to 34 age group, which is up by about 21%. Once again, we're seeing that there's an increase in female homelessness in most age groups. The exception would be in the 0 to 11 where male homelessness has increased quite substantially as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, once again, 0s to 11 as unaccompanied individuals, if we were able to have that family dissection, it would be useful to understand how many of those 0 to 11s would be accompanied by the 19 to the 34 older age group as well. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So these are the top 5 LGAs. Port Adelaide, Salisbury. So that it's not they're not a heavy concentration, but I would imagine most of them would be within the Greater Adelaide area. And if you look at the LGA changes, the largest increase was in Playford. And it's probably most prevalent amongst those in supported accommodation, where the increases have been. Okay, was there any questions from the audience around South Australia?
No, I don't think so. On to WA.
Okay, I might handball it back to James to do the remaining states.
Okay, thanks, Phil. It's good tag teaming. So on to WA. So again, we've got that, similar graph to what we've shown for the other states, showing the operational group numbers over time. So you can see, in the green, quite a large reduction in people in severely crowded dwellings, but then increases in supported accommodation and sleeping out in particular. And I think in WA, we saw largest increases in people in improvised dwellings, tents, or sleeping out of all of the states and territories. That's quite a notable observation for WA, and a reduction in people in boarding houses. We might move to the next slide. So again, this is just contrasting. So we've got numbers on the left for all people experiencing homelessness in Western Australia. On the right-hand side, those who identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin in the census. So we can sort of see a somewhat similar pattern in terms of changes, probably more of an increase in couch surfing for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population. And it's just the change in numbers for those sleeping rough is really quite confronting.
I think WA bucked the trend in terms of not providing additional resources to people during COVID. At the same time, I suppose they didn't have COVID lockdowns and didn't have COVID in the population. So so it was a different COVID context in the West. So next slide, we've just got the that male and female by age split. So again, you can see some changes, particularly in the 35 to 44 and 45 to 54 year old age groups, but even the 55 to 64 year age groups between 2016 and 2021. And the 75 plus, actually. So move to the next slide with just the sort of local government area information. So again, we've got the LGAs with the highest counts of people were Swan, Perth, Wanneroo, Stirling, and Halls Creek. And again, we saw increases in Swan, Perth, Wanneroo, and Denmark, and decreases in Stirling and West Kimberley, or Derby, West Kimberley. Can I just ask, does anyone know, just looking at that decline in Derby, West Kimberley, if there was any particular programs that sought to improve or reduce overcrowding and homelessness in remote communities? Oh, sorry. I think I'm scrolling through the people and I'm scrolling through
through the slides.
through the slides. No, I don't think I've got any Western
Um,
Australians answering questions on the line. Never mind.
Okay.
Keep on moving.
The other, I suppose, the other consideration as well is the ABS did have some challenges in collecting data in remote parts of WA and the Northern Territory. So particularly the border closures meant that we weren't able to get people and field officers in on the ground where we usually do. So we did get lower response in some of those remote areas than what we would have liked and what we did in 2016. So maybe part of that West Kimberley reduction may be part of the challenges that we had in getting people there and collecting data just as much as what was happening on the ground, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you. Now for the south.
Yeah, Tasmania. I'm just conscious of time as well. We're not going too bad. We're catching up a bit, so
yeah.
But we'll still have time. So Tasmania, again, so you can see what's really striking is that green line. So where we saw that quite large decrease in Western Australia for people living in severely crowded dwellings, Tasmania has seen quite a striking increase, as well as increases for most other operational groups apart from people in supported accommodation.
Just a quick question to Cynthia. Do you know whether or not there was additional funding for crisis accommodation in Tassie?
Yes, there was.
Yeah.
We had considerable funding for additional brokerage so people could go into hotels and motels, and we also set up safe spaces, low barrier shelters in each of the 3 regions.
Yeah. But it's not showing through in the other temporary lodging increase. It's interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, and that goes back to that question around administrative data. So Tasmania, the state government systems weren't able to provide that information. So we're very much reliant on our field officers and also the sector to be able to provide those contact points to identify people in those temporary accommodation settings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Kate. So this, so again, we've got that similar side of having our overall group of people experiencing homelessness on Census 9 on the left, those who identified as being as Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander origin on the right. Again, you can see the, I suppose, trends in the increase, particularly in severe overcrowding, couch surfing to a greater degree for those identified as Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, although recognising the numbers are small compared to some other states and territories in terms of absolute numbers, but still quite large changes nonetheless. The age group graph, this looks a little bit different and a little bit interesting to some of the other ones that we've seen. So we've tried to replicate the same approach for each state so you can sort of see differences at a national or compared to national and other states. So you can really see the large increase in people aged 25 to 34 years, probably for both males and females, as well as the 0 to 11 year old children. In terms of the local government areas, the areas with the highest counts were Launceston, then Hobart, Glenorchy, Devonport and Clarence. And again, I think all of those were saw increases in number of people, with Brighton added to the list in terms of number of people experiencing homelessness. Any questions or observations on Tasmania?
Yeah, just had one observation. It's noticeable that severe crowding seems to be a main reason for the LGA changes. I know that the mainland, there were a lot of travel restrictions, yet I recall at the time there was a lot of conversations around housing affordability in Tasmania. So I'm sort of curious whether that is a contributing factor at that point in time.
It's Cynthia here. I would think yes, it is. I think we've had an increasing crisis in affordability in Tasmania for probably since the 2016 census. We've been on the rental affordability index. We've had the least affordable capital city in the country, as well as the least affordable rest of state area for 4 to 5 years now. And that's on a measure of income into cost of rental accommodation. And I think our population's increased significantly more than the state government projections had anticipated. And a whole bunch of other factors have led to a crisis in both availability and affordability for rental accommodation in particular, and that impacts most highly on the people on the lowest incomes. And I think what we're seeing here is families staying with other families. That's a little bit speculative, but that's what I think that is. So you get severe overcrowding if you've got a whole family coming in with another whole family. I think that's what I think that's what's happening in at least some of this. So it's a housing crisis, basically.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I reckon, as recognising that that's probably developed even further nationally since our census in August 2021 as well. So I know the housing context now is quite different all over Australia now compared to when we took the census. Okay, we might move on to, I think, Northern Territory we've got next. Again, you've got a really large striking difference in the numbers of people in the Northern Territory living in severely crowded conditions, even though that's decreased in 21 and again from the decrease in 2016, but still far outnumbers the number of people captured in the other operational groups. The next graph, next slide with the graphs show a little bit more similarity between the overall population in the Northern Territory and those who are identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in the census. So we've got more similar numbers and similar trends. So again, you can see reduction in severe overcrowding, but then increases in particularly the supporters accommodation and couch surfing. Age groups, again, the Northern Territory has a more of a different age distribution to some of the other states and territories. So it's got higher rates and counts of children, which is probably if they're captured in severely overcrowded dwellings. It's probably likely driver. Lower reduction in numbers between 2016 and 2021 for children aged under 12. So.
I asked, did you have any of the similar issues that you had in WA of getting ABS officers out to remote communities?
I think to a lesser extent in Northern Territory compared to WA. So WA was really challenging with the hard border closures in being able to get staff on the ground in time. So to a lesser extent, but still conducting a census in non-urban areas of Australia is always a challenge. So it's just especially challenging with COVID restrictions on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of local government areas, so you've got LGAs for East Arnhem, West Arnhem, Darwin, Roper Gulf, and West Daly, and some of the changes. So you can see increases at Alice Springs, West Arnhem, Darwin, and McDonald.
Any NT questions? I can't see folks that I recognise from NT on the Zoom, but shout out if you've got any particular questions from NT, and I didn't recognise that you were from NT. No, on to ACT.
Okay, so ACT is our final jurisdiction we're going to look at today. So again, you've got probably notable changes of increases in almost across the board, apart from people staying temporarily with other households, and people in supported accommodation. Far and away the largest operational group that we have for the ACT. There were I think it was a 20% increase in people in severely crowded dwellings, and almost a 9% increase in people in supported accommodation. I think again, this graph it's similar to the other ones. You can see more of an increase for those identified as Aboriginal, Torres or Islander origin, particularly in supported accommodation, hostels, shelters and refuges, and still that increase for all people experiencing homelessness in the ACT. And then I think the final graph that we have in our deck today is just the that age distribution. So again, you can see it's a little bit different to some of the other states and territories. You can see quite large increases, particularly in some of the younger to middle-age age groups, so 25 to 34, people under 12, and teenagers aged up to 18.
I think in a number of states we've had this mirroring of the young adults 25 to 34, and then there's the children 0 to 11, which looks a lot like family homelessness, younger people with lower incomes, and then with accompanying children who are homeless. Leah's just wondering if anyone remembers whether or not there was particular government policy at the time in the ACT putting people into temporary accommodation in ACT. Other than you, Leah, I can't see anyone who I specifically recognise as being from ACT, so that might be tricky to answer. To take that one offline.
I can say that it's Robin from Beryl Women Inc. in Canberra. There were a number of initiatives that the ACT government put in place during COVID in terms of additional accommodation for homeless people, including motels and brokering in various places. So, yeah.
Hey Robin, it's Leah. I just so the slide before, thanks for that response. The slide before showed a or maybe it was before that one, sorry, it showed a significant drop in the people, the orange line between 2011 and 2016. So the persons in supported accommodation. So I was just looking at that and kind of, I guess, just shooting the breeze in the comments, but I was just wondering if anyone has any idea about what that reflected at the time, like whether there was some kind of government policy or measure that that would have facilitated that drop in numbers. That's all.
Don't know.
That's okay. Thanks, Robin.
Well, that takes us through all of the many states and territories. Does anyone have any general questions to go back to for the whole set of states and the national picture before we finish? No, it's been less questions than I anticipated. Never mind. Well, look, can I just say a big, huge thank you to James and Phillip for sharing all that with us. And we'll share the slides on with you. And then I did take a recording. So if that's okay, I'll share that too, so that people can sort of go through it. Sometimes I think with the data, you sort of need to be looking at other sources of information and then go backwards and forwards to kind of really get it in your head, what's happening in the data and how it relates for the different years. So thanks again, and thanks everyone for participating, and we'll see you again for another Homelessness Australia Policy Forum when we come up with the next topic. Thanks, folks. We'll finish up.
Yeah, thank you very much,
Anna,
Kate.
it looks like you might have a quick question, or are you just waving?
No, I do have a quick question. I'm sorry. Just with all of those assumptions, I was just thinking when you were asking all those questions about, you know, what was happening in the state, what was happening with supported accommodation, etc. Is there any discourse that goes on between ABS and state government departments responsible or who have the remit for those areas about what kind of assumptions you could factor into that data so that those of us on the ground that are using that data don't have to create or jump to our own kind of conclusions about what might have been the reason for an increase or a decrease in any particular area?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Short answer is very hard to know. Because we only conduct the census you know, once every 5 years, the data is just a point in time, and the information that we get, it comes from the data areas of those agencies, not necessarily the policy areas. Yeah, so and also the people who provided that information at different points in time are not necessarily the same person. So it's hard to get that continuity of information. So I guess the best you can do is you know, pretty much trawl through Google and see you know, what are the headlines at those points in time to try to build that picture. Yeah,
It's
I mean,
really complex.
Yeah,
I was just going to say it's a really complex picture too, because I think what happens within a state can vary so much within a state as well. So regionally, so we do work quite closely with the you know, state and territory government areas for, you know, housing and homelessness policy. So they kindly peer reviewed and sort of checked our data before we released it, so that they could sort of confront it against, you know, their own understanding. So we did have some discussions with them to go, okay, well, yep, this lines up with our understanding of things, but we didn't quite. Yeah, it's hard to be able to get a really clear picture, let alone being able to articulate that in a very succinct way either.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. I've just shared Hal Pawson and colleague from UNSW City Future Centre piece of work which tracks like what was the homelessness investments over COVID. It doesn't have all of the timing points, but there's quite a useful chapter in that piece of work about which states had temporary crisis responses and which states didn't, and some of the timing points are in there.
Thanks.
So
Kate.
I think we'll wrap up because we've gone over time, but thanks everyone. Thanks for being involved. Thanks again to the ABS. Love your work. And thanks so much for explaining it to us all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.
All.